My name is Christian Ramirez, and I am the Public Programs Manager at PhxArt Museum. It's so great to have you all here today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce curator and art historian Marissa Del Toro and Director of Maps, Imagery, and Geospatial Services at Arizona State University's Library, Matthew Toro. They'll be in conversation this evening around the spatial representation in cartography and the artwork of Teresita Fernández. Before we begin, I just wanted to share the format of tonight. Matthew and Marissa will be in dialogue for most of the program, but we will be taking questions at the end. So if anything comes up for you that you'd like them to kind of expand on, please feel free to send that through the chat feature. Oh, it says someone said I don't have sound. Marissa and Matt, can you hear me? I can see you guys.
I can hear you.
Okay. So maybe I would, Kelly. Oh, they can't hear me either. Okay, great. Kelly, who put that into the chat, it might be something on your end, which is, I'm actually going to go through a quick on how Zoom kind of the functions that we'll be using tonight, which is the chat and Q&A. So if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, that's where the menu bar will appear. And in there, you should have, for Kelly, the little microphone icon. If you click on that caret, that should help kind of figure out that portion. But any questions or comments that you have, if you want to send that through the chat function or the Q&A function, I'll make sure that that gets to Matthew and to Marissa at the end when we start to wrap up. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our museum members and those who donated towards this Pay What You Wish program tonight. We couldn't do what we do without you, and your continued support, especially during this time, is greatly, greatly appreciated. And with all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. So Marissa Del Toro is an independent curator and art historian of contemporary, modern, and the ancient arts of the Americas, primarily Latin America and the United States. In both her professional and personal life, she continues to work towards the promotion and advocacy for diverse narratives within art. Del Toro has worked at PhxArt Museum, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, the Getty Research Institute, and participated in the 2015 Latino Museum Studies Program at the Smithsonian Latino Center. She graduated from the University of Texas and at San Antonio with her MA in art history, and is originally from Southern California, where she received her BA in art history from the University of California, Riverside. Matthew Toro is a geographer serving as the Director of Maps, Imagery, and Geospatial Services at ASU Library. While his research projects are diverse, ranging from the agrarian landscapes in Laos to urban landscapes in Miami to iconic landscapes of the Grand Canyon, they always rely heavily on cartography to communicate geographic information. Thank you both for being here. Thank you all for being here tonight as well. And I'm gonna hand it over to Marissa.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. Really appreciate that to be in discussion with Matthew. I kind of just wanted to take a moment first to acknowledge the land and space we exist in and are connected to currently, especially in terms of today's discussion. So I start by acknowledging that I currently reside in the traditional territory and homelands of Luiseño, Bayoko-Wisham, and Coahuila people in the unceded land of Southern California. I send gratitude and respect to the ancestral, present, and future elders and members of these communities. I also want to acknowledge that this virtual program is presented by the PhxArt Museum and exists on the ancestral territories and traditional homelands of the Hohokam and Ohodam people. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat box in case you want to check out the native land that you are currently occupying and existing in as well. Also, just to start with the intro of this exhibition, this phenomenal exhibition. Teresita Fernández Elemental is the first mid-career retrospective of internationally acclaimed American artist Teresita Fernández, born 1968 in Miami, lives in New York. Fernández is a conceptual artist best known for her immersive installations and sculptures and her monumental public art commissions. Her conceptually based work is rooted in challenging conventional definitions of landscapes by deconstructing traditional genres of landscape painting and land art to reveal more urgent narratives. Fernández places particular importance on her critical choice of materials such as gold, graphite, charcoal, and other minerals that have complex histories often tied to colonialism, land, and power. And as you can see here, the first work that we're looking at tonight is Fire United States of the Americas 2. This is from 2018 image from the McNay Art Museum. And it shows a charred landscape of charcoal bits or charcoal land masses of the United States with charcoal bits of Mexico on the right of it, kind of going off into the cosmos, floating like little stars. And Matthew, we went in the galleries and we talked about this in person, and I kind of gave some background a little bit about like the work in itself. And the title of this work, just to bring it up again, is United States of the Americas. This is a plural form of the word Americas. So that is vitally important for this piece of work because it's kind of talking about how the Americas are a large body of land that includes multiple countries and an entire hemisphere, not just the United States. I know like within the United States, you kind of just say singular term America, kind of forgetting about that. America consists of multiple countries and land masses and space. And I think that kind of starts really well in a great discussion of like thinking about geography in terms of Teresita Fernández's work and how we think about land and
Yeah.
and yeah, do you want
No,
to
go ahead.
kind
Yeah,
of
I was going to say, yeah. So, you know, we're tiny, sort of microscopic little beings
yeah,
occupying these vast land masses, right? Like continental sized land masses. And so much of our understanding of what those land masses actually look like is pure abstraction, right? Like we don't actually see the shape of the United States. We see what our eyes and, you know, what we can see with our own senses. So we use these maps to sort of conceptualize, okay, this is the Americas or this is our country. But you're absolutely right. Like the Americas, you know, depending on where you got your education, you know, in some countries they actually teach it as one single continental landmass, as the Americas. When students, I think, in certain European and certain Latin American countries learn about what is the Americas. So even the partitioning of the space and how we clearly one of the main things that is striking about this is the repositioning of the space, right? The repositioning of these two sort of iconic countries that we think so naturally and iconically, like, oh, they're supposed to be juxtaposed in a certain way, and that's the right way. But that's really fantastic what Teresita has done here, sort of flipping our preconceived notions of how the space should be organized, because again, it all is just abstraction, and making us really think about these two, I mean, however you want to do it, these geopolitical actors, these containers of people, of commodities, of flows. There's so many ways to look at this.
definitely. And thinking it like, I know when you go into the gallery and you see this large map of the United States and you're thinking about like how the boundaries are so kind of cut and rigid on like one half of the United States, the West Coast, and then like the East Coast are just like, okay, what happened?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but then also thinking about the land's it's not cut up that way. It's all imaginary. And
Imaginary lines on
yeah,
maps, but yet they're imagined lines that we codify and communicate to each other with these human artifacts known as maps, but they have real world implications. Like
yes.
look at the border wall separating these two giant masses. And I love that observation. It's so true of the way, you know, if you look at these sort of puzzle pieces of the way these 50 states or contiguous 48 states come together, you see a lot more straight geometric lines, right angles. And that's because it shows sort of how arbitrary some of these lines are. A lot of the borders between these states are actually on lines of latitude, parallels. And you see a little bit sort of more towards the East Coast and the Appalachian region, and the Mississippi region, you have more natural looking lines. And those are more prescribed by nature, like the river delineating, you know, the states of Kentucky, for instance. But out here in the West, yeah, it's a sort of arbitrary, manifest destiny. Let's throw these lines on maps and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and I think that's like part of it too, is like to think about the history before, you know, the ancestral history, the ancient history that has, you know, of these lands that have gone through, and thinking about how they're also speaking on indigenous knowledge and indigenous lives and history that we kind of overlook in terms of when we kind of throw out manifest destiny and
Yeah.
um,
That's very, it's actually a very sobering subject because, yeah, I mean, the sort of how arbitrarily these lines were drawn on maps, sometimes very sort of haphazardly, just, a bunch of sort of colonizers, America itself, the United States of America is itself an imperialist actor, right? I mean, the 13 original colonies were on the East Coast and we continue to annex. That's what Manifest Destiny is all about. But the major fallacy of all this is that the historical erasure, it wasn't some sort of vacant, empty Western lands. These were lands with thriving communities, which had their own civilization, their own cultures, their own trade with others. And I'm going to jump out of the Americas for a second, but one of the most notorious cases of this is with the Conference of Berlin in 1884. And you look at the map of Africa, it's basically where the European colonial powers got together in Africa, in Berlin, and had a map on the wall. They're like, okay, UK or Britain, you take this, France, you get this, Germany, you get this. And what happened is real human beings, real communities on the ground had arbitrary lines on maps cut right between their communities, creating the foundations for ethnic strife, et cetera. And we see that here. It's very convenient for us to sort of say, oh, that only happens in Africa or somewhere else. But this is still an active unfolding of American history to this day that we're witnessing live.
It totally is. And thinking about how the imagination of Teresita to position Mexico next to the US as larger than what it is in terms of landmass. But also thinking about how that presence is speaking on certain historical travesties that have happened, like 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. How that caused a host of issues because the United States changed things in the treaty that were not originally agreed upon. And that still has reverberations today where certain individuals, people, communities are still fighting for the land that was promised but is not given by the United States government.
Sure.
So
I think there's a lot of takes. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry if I interrupted. Did you finish? Yeah. I think there's a lot of takes on this. I mean, and that's the beauty of art. So many, for every spectator, one can, or every audience member, she or he can sort of find meaning in her or his own way. But clearly repositioning Mexico, sort of inflating the size of Mexico and putting it really on par with the United States. That's sort of the first thing. It may be a simplistic read on this, but really just literally shifting it over and putting it at the same plane level. I'm sure you're familiar with, I'm sure many audience members are familiar with the sort of Monroe Doctrine, which basically promulgates that Latin America is the United States backyard, basically a message from the United States to Europe, like, hey, European colonial powers, this is our realm of imperialism, Latin America. And I couldn't help but think just because of sort of geographical fate, Mexico is south of the United States. And because we sort of think things that are up on the north of maps are somehow better or more dominant, sort of, it reinforces that hegemonic geopolitical sort of patron-client relationship between the United States and Mexico.
Yeah, and that was what we were talking about earlier about the Mercator projection and how that kind of, I know you'll explain it a little bit more, but how that has created a sense of with you predominantly in the US and a lot of other places, for individuals to kind of think of countries and continents closer to the equator as being less than or inferior or smaller because they're in the map, that Mercator projection, they're seen as smaller. Maybe you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, let's absolutely talk more about that. But yeah, and I just want to sort of bring it back to a comment I made earlier, and that was building on a comment you made earlier, Marissa, that, maps are the way we conceptualize our own place. Well, first, they give us a vision of what the world is, because outside of that, the world is just this abstract thing, but maps allow us to sort of have a model of the earth. But where we reside, where actual human beings reside in that model of the earth, can affect the way they perceive their own agency and their own value in that earth. So, there are definitely some sort of implicit interpretations that are communicated with maps. As you kind of alluded to, I'm more Mercator receives a lot of slack. These are a lot of flack, but I sort of come to his defense often because I try to contextualize him in his own era. But yeah, so all maps, here's a real takeaway, and we were talking about this earlier, Marissa, but all maps are inherently wrong. The best model of the Earth is something like this, like a globe, because it takes what the Earth actually is, a sphere, or technically a spheroid, and a slightly imperfect sphere, and just scales it down. So at least all the dimensions and everything are preserved. But a map inherently is a two-dimensional bit of geographic information. So when you take a three-dimensional object, you must twist and distort and warp it. And so something is going to get lost in that warping, either the shape or the size. And the beauty, let me apologize for Mercator here, but the beauty of the Mercator projection is that in the 16th century, the age of discovery, European age of discovery, you have seafaring mariners that are, basically it's an entire ocean-based economy, which of course led to, in and of itself, is a form of imperialism, and it's really proto-capitalism, which we can get into, but we'd rather not. But basically, the beauty of this projection, this representation of geography, is that it preserved angles, so directions, and distances. So when you're a navigator, a seafaring navigator, those two critical attributes, the direction that you need to go in and the distance that you need to traverse, those are critical. The unfortunate artifact of that is that we kept the Mercator for so long. And there's something that I'll mention later, but we're basically stuck with the Mercator for a long time. And I'll preview now, because most web maps that we now come accustomed to all use by default the web Mercator. And actually for the same reason that the navigators did, because it preserves mathematically, it's easier for computers to process it. So when we have little web apps and we're doing web navigation, so preserving distances and directions, it's better for computers, although it creates some geographic distortion. Sorry for my rant, Marissa.
No, that brought a lot of context to the Mercator projection, and it wasn't a bad tool. It was just not used in the correct way, I think, in terms of educational geography, which a lot of individuals, I'm still learning my countries and certain continents. I'm not ashamed.
Sure.
And I think this is what that is the issue at hand, and it influenced people's view of the world, to consider, again, the inferiority complex, superiority. And I think that's also why this movement of the placement of Mexico next to the United States kind of shows how there is no dominant narrative that is in existence. It doesn't always have to be a superiority complex. And
Certainly.
And also this leads perfectly to this map that you brought up, which I'll let you explain it a little bit more, and then we can talk about what I saw.
I don't want to, we have so much of Teresita's exhibition to go through, and so many other pieces, but I couldn't help, I share a connection with the artist, with Teresita Fernández, in that I'm from Miami myself, and I used to do a lot of mapping, Miami-centric mapping, and one of the many sort of cartographic exercises, if you will, that I conducted was a series of maps that basically charted all of the distances from Miami to all the major world cities. And I define world cities as being with at least 1 million persons. And I couldn't help but think of my old work. This is from 2014, a few years back. And, sort of changing perspective. Actually, this post was called Into Perspective, because I deliberately sort of flipped the maps upside down or sideways, because the truth is there's no technical requirement or prerequisite for making north be at the top. And so really, when you look at these maps, when I was making these maps, I was sort of taken aback, because we're not used to seeing space this way. It's a typical abstraction, but we're not used to, it's not the iconic classroom wall map that we're used to seeing. Our perspective has been twisted. And that sort of reflects the dialectic between our reflection or our interpretation and the map itself. The map gives us an interpretation, and by extension, we sort of go out in our day-to-day lives carrying those notions of the way space operates. So anyway, I couldn't help but sort of plug my own work and show off some of this stuff, because it invokes some of the same cartographic tricks that Teresita did with her piece, sort of repositioning things and sort of turning it upside down to make us rethink the way we perceive geography.
Yeah, and definitely, I kind of view it similarly. Can we go back one? Just let's finish that one first. When I saw this, it made me think immediately of Joaquin Torres Garcia, a Uruguayan artist, America Invertida, 1943 pen and ink drawing, and I should have had a picture, but it totally reminded me of this where he flipped South America upside down and be like, this is our north, and
Yeah.
the north is the south. He reversed it, and it was a counter to American cultural imperialism, European colonization, where it always positioned again as like North America and Europe as the top, and being again this whole dominant narrative. And I think that's like similar in tune with what Teresita is doing by positioning Mexico to the side of the United States. It's flipping it, and it's countering those ideologies of superiority that have like been part of colonization for centuries. So I think it's brilliant.
And I don't want to belabor this, but very briefly, I spent a little time in China. The word in Putonghua, in Mandarin Chinese for China is Zhonghua, which is middle country or center country. Mm-hmm. And it sort of reflects the impulse that I think all humans naturally have to place themselves in the center of space. Yeah. You may have seen posts, I hope maybe some of our audience members have, of these sort of declassified or revealed maps produced like official country maps of North Korea produced by the North Korean government. And of course, they center North Korea as the center of the world. And it reflects sort of like the propensity of all humanity to think of their world as the center of the world, starting at the individual level all the way to collectives like nations and political bodies. Good points. And I want to check out that Uruguayan artist stuff. Please share that later.
Yeah, I'll throw his name in the chat. Maybe we can go to the next slide and we can talk about this other map that you added to the conversation.
Yeah, I stayed up really late last night because I was like, gosh, I really want to show some cool stuff. But I just put this together to really demonstrate that the point I tried to articulate earlier, that maps inherently are all wrong. Let's start with that premise, because that's the truth. All maps are wrong. If anything, maybe the map in this sequence or the projection was that one, the one that simulates a sphere, although that in and of itself is wrong, or simulates a globe. A globe is the best model of the Earth you can ever have. And of course, there are a multitude of different map projections. There are, without exaggeration, an innumerable quantity of map projections, because they are mathematical formulas that you can infinitely adjust to focus on different things. So some of these projections some are very common and some are less common, but they have different purposes. And the problem with the Mercator is that it's a carryover from the 16th century. And it's sort of, as you rightly pointed out, Marissa, it sort of stayed as the iconic classroom map that so many of us are familiar with. And that's why in the late 20th century, there was a lot of pushback against it. And that's why major mapping organizations like the National Geographic moved away from the Mercator projection way early on, I think in the early 20th, and moved towards other projections that some are listed here. It's moving too fast to get into it, but there's alternative projections that do a better balancing act of compromising between the four cartographic elements that must be warped: shape, area, distance, direction. So the beauty of Mercator, it preserves shapes beautifully. The real shape that we see, the shapes of the landmasses on Mercator are correct. What it distorts are the areas. So it preserves shape, distance, and direction, but it distorts areas, thus creating this disproportionate and misleading, potentially dangerously misleading view of the world. And I will say this though, because I do come to Mercator's defense often. One of the first attempts to sort of counter the Mercator projection is the Gall-Peters, which preserves area perfectly, but it distorts shape terribly, and it looks like it's like dripping, like a weeping map. So there's an aesthetic concern too, but let me not belabor that. We have so much more art to talk about.
Yeah, this is a view of the current installation at PhxArt Museum. So if you visit, you can see this room, gallery room. And we see here in the middle, Fire from 2005. That's the hand-dyed yarn, silk yarn threads hanging down. It kind of creates this kind of like, almost like a scope, the movement, elusive projection. And then we see in the background, we see kind of the panels of Fire America series, along with around the room, there are this like charcoal drawings that Teresita did. She came in when we were installing this and hand drew and add a lot of the touches to the work. And this creates like a very like cinematic effect of placing ourselves. And I think that's one of the important parts of Teresita's work, is thinking about where you are, and you kind of brought this up, Matt, about, with reference to the Chinese ideology of placing ourselves in the cosmos, like where are we centered in. This room kind of centers you within a fiery landscape. The panel works are of ceramic tesserae, and depicting a night scene of a blazing landscape. And it was created during around the 2016 presidential election, so tumultuous period within the United States. So it speaks on kind of like, the violence, the values, the mindsets of of the US at the moment. It was very fiery, but it also touches upon like indigenous knowledge of slash burning techniques that was very common before the period of colonization within the actual United States, and how this was actual way to create sustainability and push against, it was very important for the environment. And now that we see with like a lot of the recent wildfires in California, my home state, without those kind of techniques being carried out, it's causing a lot of, destruction and mass issues. So I think there's also like a reflection on how this piece is about indigenous knowledge and techniques kind of being very important to the land that we reside in, possibly combating certain climate and global warming changes that are happening. And that's
Certainly.
the thing. Yeah, and that's the thing with Teresita's work too. It pulls in material as a connection to the land that you're, thinking of in its existence in the work. So these are ceramic, it's clay, and thinking how this land material is creating a image of this landscape. So again, it's turning the genre of landscape on in itself. The charcoal is material, burnt wood, and it's also kind of centering again this fiery landscape that we're existing in the installation.
I find a lot of the tropes, a lot of the sort of concepts that you're explaining, kind of permeating so many of Teresita's pieces. Virtually all of them, dare I say, they're all inherently geographical, and not the geography that many lay people think is geography. Naming capitals on a map, which is the antithesis of all professional geographers cringe when we hear people sort of conceptualizing what we do like that. But sort of the focus on the historical trajectories, the created place, the evolution of spaces through time. And moreover, because so much of the evolutionary drivers of spatial transformations are involved with extraction, commoditization, the production, the accumulation of wealth, and the production of value, but through the exploitation of nature. And this one was actually very sobering. I think I took this piece in particular through a very sort of less abstract and very objective lens, and perhaps undermining many layers of meaning that Teresita meant to convey. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the last several years have been politically tumultuous, but also, with the climatic crises that we've been aware of for decades, and the sort of exacerbating, the deepening of these climate and by extension, environmental crises that kind of collectively humanity and our global governance institutions and our leadership at the political level seems to sort of fail to address, and sort of the increasing severity and direness, if you will, of it. When not only politics, but you just look at the proliferation of wildfires. I'm working with professors here at ASU, teaching humanities students how to sort of communicate and tackle these sort of wicked problems of multifaceted climate change and the wildfires, which happen almost perennially, like all year long. Like, the world, some part of the earth is always literally burning, whether it be in Australia, or whether it be in the Congo, or whether it be in the Amazon, or whether it be closer to home here in California. The earth is burning, and sort of, it's just combined with all the other multitude of socio-ecological dilemmas that we're collectively facing. This was a powerful piece.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I think also it's not just like, that like everything's burning and like it's so like apocalyptic dystopian. I think also there's like this sense of like there, growth can come from the burning, like,
Certainly.
because indigenous knowledge used slash burning techniques, like that showed how like the world was, the earth, the land was cleaned away and made for new growth the next following
Sure.
few years,
Sure.
so it is a technique that is vital, but the way we're currently existing is not in tune with that technique. But you did hit up like a very big point of how Teresita's work is very geographical, but not in the way that most individuals think of geography. It speaks on the land, the material, the placement. And I just want to share this quote that she had in an interview with Maria Elena Ortiz, the co-curator of this at PhxArt Art Museum. She quote says, "What shapes our contemporary perspective of a geographic location or people is material culture." And I think that's vitally important for her work because, so much of it is materials. And maybe we can go to the next slide and check out more of the materials that she uses beyond graphite and clay. So here was another amazing room that we got to be in. And this shows on the back walls, sfumato. It's almost like a swarming like piece. There's movement. When you go around the room, there's movement. But they're made up of thousands of small bits of graphite adhered to the wall. And then you see in the on the left wall that we have a Aurora 1. That is another graphite piece with pencil drawing. And then we see on the right side, Drawn Waters, Borrowdale. And this is completely made of graphite. And thinking about where these materials, that is very fascinated by minerals, especially mined, some tritium, stuff coming directly from the earth.
Yes.
Materials such as gold, charcoal, graphite, glass, lapis lazuli, marble. I can go on. And thinking about how the Drawn Water Borrowdale kind of speaks to the, discovery of graphite in Borrowdale, England in the 1500s. And this kind of set the boom for the pencil industry. That's what we use graphite every day. And we still use pencils, I do, at least. And that just brings to mind like how materials we don't associate as being from the earth are commonplace and everyday part of our lives. They're so vitally important.
Yeah,
what is
I
your
agree.
take?
I deeply agree. Frankly, this one, everything, the pieces on the wall are sort of productions, right? But then
Mhm.
What struck to me is sort of Teresita leaves us with not just the final product, which in our modern day-to-day lives is what consumes our perspectives, right? Where we are surrounded not by sites of extraction or sites of waste. Like, how often do we actually drive next to the landfills where all of our consumer waste goes? How often do we go to the sewage plant and the water processing plant where our urban metabolism flows of water actually cycle through? How often do we see the raw mine? How often do we drive through the copper mines of Globe and Miami or Jerome, whatever, and really sort of come face to face with the sites of extraction and the sites of natural resource accumulation. What we see is clothing, right? We are wearing cotton, right? But we don't see the fields of cotton right now. We see, the final end product. So I think a lot of what Teresita does is really kind of bring us back to the earth, but in very innovative ways, sort of making us think about the raw materials that allow our modern metabolism, our modern consciousness, our modern day-to-day lives unfold so conveniently, while sort of reminding us that at the end of the day, we are products of the earth, just like everything else we consume. And we're surrounded by even the metal in these map cabinets behind me, or the cotton in this clothing, et cetera.
Definitely, 100%. She definitely does bring up like the raw materials of the work. And I think that we can see that most aptly in the next slide. I think this is the right slide I'm thinking of. Yeah, Bañales. We see, so just to kind of give a visual description of this work. So we see these green malachite pieces. They're kind of bulbous, resting on these pedestals that are concrete pedestals. They're reminiscent of Brancusi style of modern design. So kind of playing, I think this work is it's one of my favorite works to encounter of Teresita's, because there's so much playing here where it's like speaking about the material, but also about the histories involved within that material. And maybe we can
Yes.
see the installation shot. Next slide.
Yes. The historical, yeah, the historical materialism, absolutely.
Oh,
And
maybe go back one.
yeah, sorry. Uh,
Yeah, so just to kind of give some more additional background, the malachite is from source from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and for Teresita, it reminded her of this photograph uh, of Cuba, specifically the Vinales Valley in Cuba, which has which shows like these migotes, these 300 tall like land masses in this valley. So it creates this lush landscape, and it takes her on a journey and takes us on the viewer on the journey, if we know this history and knowledge that she's playing here with, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Cuba, and then also thinking about the European modern style concrete pedestals that are playing. So we can go maybe next slide and see a zoom in of where the Democratic Republic.
Yeah, I
Congo is.
threw this together just to sort of contextualize and visualize, right? Again,
Yeah.
it's all abstraction. Like none of us will ever see with our own eyes this view of the Earth unless we get the privilege of flying a private space flight. But you know, Democratic Republic of Congo is the heart of Africa. And often, you know, we could talk about it in the abstract. We said DRC, but you know, DRC, and it's totally okay. And the United States of America has phenomenally weak geography education. It's okay to acknowledge that, you know, some people may not know where DRC is. And so these sort of, and these transatlantic, transcontinental flows of commodities, right? Linking Democratic Republic of Congo and Cuba and the rest of the United States. And then we happen to be here in the interior of the North American continent in metropolitan Phoenix in the early 21st century, conversing about these flows. So, you know, there's material flows and then there's information flows, et cetera.
Yeah, and this goes to a concept that Teresita speaks on. It's called wayfinding and journeying through the materiality of materials in her work. And so as you mentioned, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a very rich source for minerals and materials such as malachite. And historically also, it was one of like the key centers for forced colonization. Many individuals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, before it was that, were enslaved and sent to Americas, but actually were one of the first stops for many of them was the Vinales area of Cuba. So thinking about this history of colonization, you know, historical movement, the historical wayfinding of these objects that are placing us and taking us on a journey from Africa to Cuba, where a lot of the individuals would actually, if they ran away from the plantations in Cuba, the enslaved individuals, they would hide in under the migotes for safety, and hoping that they would not be seen or caught again. And
I think there's some images of migotes here, right? Maybe we should go to the next slide. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, well, here's the valley.
Yeah, here's the valley. And I think maybe, I can't really tell from this representation of what a migote look. Maybe it's like one of the large land masses there.
There should be an additional slide right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that was probably it, the large landmass that we were flying over, which is, you know, we'll never get the opportunity again. But how these were notable places of safety for enslaved Africans. But then also thinking about how these were also areas that the indigenous Taino people and community lived around and, you know, existed under. And it was a place of refuge for them as well before colonization. So, I mean, the Vinales pieces are all marked by this histories of displacement, colonial exploitation, and dislocation of so many lives, so many communities. And here's a panel, and again, a ceramic tesseract panel that is of a kind of a zoom in of the malachite piece. And you see the golden browns, the lush green that kind of again transports us to this like other landscape that we currently don't exist, but once we are in front of it, viewing it, if you go into the PhxArt Museum, it takes you, it transports you.
Absolutely. Power of imagery. Absolutely.
Definitely. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I think it's a good way to kind of wrap up. And, again, I love pulling quotes. Yeah, again, another interview with Maria Elena Ortiz. Teresita says that she intentionally pulls from a lot of historical, cultural, geographical references. Quote, for many diverse cultural and historical references, she is seeing what happens when they overlap and merge into one another, both visually and conceptually, end quote. And that's like also the key point. Her work is layered, stacked layers of meaning that are referencing the actual place of something, but the materiality of that place, the history of that place, and the people. It's also about the people who live there, who do live there and continue to. So there, for Teresita, she refers to this as stacked landscape. Much of her work is a weaving of conceptual landscapes and material elements into alternative narratives. And that kind of throws back to like the reimagination of what she sees and like how she positioned Mexico right next to the US, reimagining the world around her. And it's all about the interconnected histories, cultures, and people that we may not really perceive from the beginning, but showing how like there's a lot of networks and connections that we do not consider in our everyday life. But when you view Teresita's work, you start to kind of move the layers around and you see all of this like rich history and information that she's pulling from. And I know when we went to go see this, you had a really great interpretation of this work, Matt.
Well, it took me a while. This was a rather enigmatic piece. Everything else was, all the other pieces of Teresita's, I would say stay there for, were sort of more direct to me, and the message was clear to me. I needed time to sort of take this one in, but when I did, I might be overreaching here, but I couldn't help, in geography, sometimes at the risk of oversimplification, or with any intellectual sort of scholarly pursuit, any sort of lens or framework with which to make sense of the world, sometimes the framework can be very simplistic and it can involve binary thinking. And I couldn't help but resist the urge to look at the binary of this space. It took several moments to really embrace it, but this space, actually, could I ask the moderator to go back one more slide to the more encompassing version? Oh, yeah. So this space is actually quite barren and boring and empty. While on the other hand, you have these sort of nodes, these centers of almost like light and dare I say luxury. You can't see it here. We'll look at it in the next slide in a moment, but there's actually beautiful tiled floors in each of these areas. And sort of the binary, several binaries came to my mind. One is sort of, one could be, again, extraction and accumulation, where sort of the rest is this sort of barren intermediate space between these nodes are the spaces of extraction and exploitation, while the nodes themselves are the sites of accumulation and wealth and extravagance. And you could extrapolate this, you could extend that, again, unless I'm overreaching, but you can extend that to sort of the urban rural dichotomy or binary. So many of Earth's natural resources come from rural, agrarian, remote areas, and they get siphoned, they get centralized in these in metropolitan regions, right? And there's so many other binaries we could apply. Patron, client, rich, poor, core, periphery, right? If you're invoking sort of a geographical hierarchy and subservient relationship. But yeah, that's fundamentally what I took from it. I took from it. And again, I could be way off here. I'm just viewing this as a geographer. I took from it sort of, and it looks almost brighter in this photo than the way I perceived it when I was there. When I was in the intermediate space, I felt an emptiness, a barrenness, almost like a place that has already been extracted and toiled, while these nodes, these well-lit and beautifully lit nodes with beautiful tiles sort of represented to me the opulence and luxury of the sites of accumulation. But again, I'm just a geographer. What am I?
No, your interpretation was, I found it very like insightful, and it kind of like blew my mind. the fact that that you keep describing it as this binary, barren um, movement. And that's for Teresita, this piece it's titled Borrowed Landscapes.
And just that name, I'm sorry, I just want to reemphasize that for anyone listening. Borrowed landscapes, like that to me, I think maybe the epiphany, or like when I came to that, I think one of you, Marissa, or the education
Christian.
manager, Christian, who's doing the moderation in the back end, like it is borrowed, like sort of taken from one part of the earth and flowing through flows of commodities, flows of people, flows of labor, flowing it and centralizing it in another location, like a beautifully lit location like this.
So this is one of her earlier pieces from 1998. And, you know, it's actually based in kind of the structure, the placement of these sheer fabrics and these, you know, into these square modules, nodes, as you call them, based on like kind of European gardens. So that's why I was smiling, because I was like, you know, European gardens are very strict. They're very delineated. There's a strict path. You do not, you know, they are maze-like, and they are structured to control. They're very authoritarian, and how you move within these around this, you know, structures. So it's very interesting how you took that as very binary, because it's like very European, like thinking of things as like this or that, good or evil, you know. And so that is what the knowledge that is being placed here and played with. And yeah, and like even the tile floors, you're not allowed to go in, but you can peek through, and see that the floors are actually hand-drawn replicates from a 17th century garden hedge pattern. And so again, it's playing with this European structure of you know, nature that is being extracted and you know, changed and kind of commodified into certain ways. So I thought that was like really great way to kind of just end this conversation. I think we kind of hit a lot of the parts of Teresita's work within a very short time.
It's an honor. Yeah, it's an honor to even be, you know, musing publicly about this phenomenal artist's work. Yeah, it's great to be here. I don't want to bite into any of the sort of audience's opportunities to provide feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we can open it for Q&A. I can't remember what the last two slides were. Sorry.
What do you say, Christian, in the background?
Here we go.
Yeah.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to, you can submit it through the chat or through the Q&A function, and I can read it out loud to, if it's for one of them or for both of them. I guess the only, it's more of a, the one question that came up to me when it was, you guys were talking, was kind of thinking of flat earthers, which Matthew, I'm sure that comes up often, but like just seeing what you were saying about how like the land masses, well, there's never like a perfect representation of them because it is a globe.
Unless you're a flat earther, in which case the map isn't like perfect, you know. Yeah, it's yeah, flat earthers, with all due respect, you know, at the risk of offending anyone in our audience, I hope not, who is a flat earther. Yeah, yeah, that's phenomenal that in the 21st century with transcontinental flights and space exploration and an international space station and regular photo satellite with dozens, without exaggeration, dozens of satellites orbiting our Earth, that flat earthism is a thing. But yeah, it's cartographic. I don't even know what to say there. I'm just,
that's a lot. So yeah,
it just was something that came into my brain just watching, because it's just like, how could, whatever, you know, people got their thoughts, but
yeah, they do.
Conspiracy theories are fun, you know, and it's yeah.
Let's not get on that.
It used to be. Okay, well, there's no questions. Is there anything else that you two would like to share before we wrap up?
Ooh, I'm gonna look. I'm like,
well, if you're at liberty to, Christian, I threw in a couple of slides at the very end if there's no more questions. But again, sort of I hope it's not too self-interested, but Teresita's work, sort of that last piece, Borrowed Landscapes, also made me think of some previous mapping work I had done of mapping North American metro regions. So I talked about several binaries that, you know, if you're willing to invoke that interpretation of that piece, you know, core, periphery, rural, urban, extraction, accumulation, nature, society is one I didn't mention, but I don't know if you're able to share that, and it's okay. It's anticlimactic if you can't. But I made some maps that basically had a lot of the same visual technique that Teresita employed in her built installation, where everything is sort of dark on the outside, on the periphery, again, core periphery, while in the inside of these clusters or nodes, whatever you are, spaces, however you want to think of them, they're lit up and beautiful and cool. Thank you so much for indulging me. So, you know, I mapped out metropolitan spaces. This is several years ago, and I thought of sort of the installation of the Earth at night. If you look at satellite images of the Earth at night, it looks like that right there. So sort of by darkening out everything and sort of only lighting up, only making the cities glow. And actually, could you go to the next one that isn't dynamic? It's just a flat static image. Next slide. Yeah. So again, I was doing this with a completely different objective, and I may be overreaching with my grandiose interpretation of Teresita's work, but it had the sort of same tact, the same visual communication technique of darkening the rest, and actually the nodes or the pockets of light actually speak to not only themselves, like those centers of light, but also speak to the absence, like there's something here, but there's nothing everywhere else. And that nothingness is what I think is so profound about Teresita's space. And when I was standing there in borrowed landscapes, is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt empty. You know, I was in the void, as it were. But I was surrounded by these distant, like you can't penetrate them, you can't go in them. But I was sort of lured by these beautiful spaces that, you know, I'm compelled to walk into. I would like to dance on these beautiful tiled floors, but I couldn't. I was sort of stuck in the periphery or stuck in the underclass or whatever. But again, I think I'm exercising too much.
No, I think that is upon one of her other concepts that she's playing with, in sense of this immensity, but also this huge largeness. And we kind of see that in Sfumato, this, you know, swarm of graphite pieces, very large. There's thousands of them. But then realizing that they're all these little bits, they're so small, and you know, it's this contraction and expansion of the self within these spaces within her art. And in front of them, you kind of go through, you have some existential, you know, thinking a moment, and you're like, wow, I'm very small, but then also I'm very big too. So it's just thinking about the power dynamics within yourself, the space that you're in, you know, and thinking about the immensity, but also the smallness that is tying you down a little bit too. So I think this is a really awesome map. I love the, you know, moving light one. Felt very techno.
Yeah, it dances, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it and that basically stratifies the different cities. Basically, you know, that GIF, it's basically just an animated sequence of maps, but it shows oh, if you only look at these cities. And again, I created these years ago when I admittedly had no knowledge of the existence of Teresita Fernández, although she's been a successful world-class artist for decades. But yeah, but when I saw that work, I was like, wait, you know, that's kind of, you know, it made me think of this as well. And again, invoking that binary, however crude it may be, sort of centers of population, centers of wealth, centers of humanity, of human population and settlement, but so much of that dark space, and this, I mean, wow, we could draw so many political tangents here, so much of that dark space, which, if I may, you know, a lot of that dark space are the areas that go red, right? These are the more agricultural spaces of the world, but so much of the urban network that we see here relies on the blacked out area, you know, the agricultural or the flows of agricultural products of staple goods of the food that we eat on a daily basis. And again, invoking the sort of extraction and accumulation or population and lack thereof, et cetera.
Well, also that there's a system of reliance too, thinking of the small makes up the whole, and, you know, thinking of sfumato and the small graphite pieces, they may be thousands of them, but they make up this whole mass, you know, and thinking about that power too. You know, I won't go into say whether that's bad or good. It's just what it is. And this is the reality of it. And thinking that there's no moral compass, I guess, you know, per se, and thinking of that immensity and smallness. It's just, it is what it is. And 1,000 small pieces make up can make up a, giant mountain. So I think, like thinking about in terms of politics too, yeah, like we're all in kind of this circuits, of networks where we're all like having to coexist with each other. You can't just, turn off parts of it, even though we may not like it. So it's just about like thinking about coexisting and thinking about how we all have some relation to each other, whether or not we want to admit it.
That was amazing. It seems like a really great place to stop, unless there's any other questions from the audience. But thank you both so much.
I just want to throw out to Janice. Sorry, I just saw her comment. Yes, the artificial borders also disappear. I love that. Thank you for that ad. Sorry.
And real quick, I can't help but look at Nate Turner's excellent question. Anyone here have a favorite?
I missed those questions, so I apologize.
I love that. So the sort of the rub there, Nate, is what do you want to map, right? What's the purpose of your map? But yeah, if you're doing just a traditional world map, I'm a real fan of the Robinson, which was the official National Geographic map projection for a while after they abandoned Mercator. Robinson was in vogue for quite some time. It does a really nice job of balancing shape and area and distance and all those other and the cartographic elements that I mentioned earlier. But now they use something called the Winkle triple, which usually they're named, these obscure sounding projections are named after the cartographer or mathematician who develops them, because developing a map projection is actually very complex mathematical work. But the Winkle triple, and the triple in that projection name refers to the preservation, the nice balancing of area, shape, and direction or distance, I think. But I like that projection in particular. Again, it's the National Geographic the officially adopted National Geographic one, Nate. But yeah, there's so many, as that animation at the beginning of the slideshow demonstrates. There's literally infinite number of map projections. So what do you want to map? How do you want to show it? Great question. Thank you for that.
Which on that, I dropped in the chat ways to be able to connect with both Marissa and Matthew. And for Matthew, it's a link to the Geospatial Hub.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, the Map and Geospatial Hub. Thank you so much for doing that.
Currently, we're at a time where we're not really going into the world, but eventually we'll be back. But there's a lot of great resources on that website to be able to interact in that way. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining tonight. Please come to the museum. We're open. And if you aren't able to because you're not physically in Phoenix or don't feel comfortable, we do have Teresita's catalog available for purchase through our museum store, which has beautiful images of the exhibition and pulls a lot of the text that Marissa quoted from today. And if you're a museum member, you get a discount. Otherwise, holidays are coming, and that's a great gift to ask. So thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna make a quick plug. Teresita Fernández will actually be doing a lecture as well, coming up December 10th. It'll be live streamed through our PhxArt Museum's YouTube page. There's more information on that on our website. So keep an eye out for that, RSVP on our link, and have a great evening. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.
Marissa, Christian, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Teresita Fernández.
Thank you, Teresita.